very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jonathan Robinson and I am the moderator for tonight's conversation, and I welcome you on behalf of Musselburgh Baptist Church and the Otago University Centre for Theology and Public Issues and the Musselburgh Rise Community Trust. Who's got a mobile phone with them tonight? Don't need to raise a hand, but please turn it off sound. So, very simple rule, if your phone goes off during the conversation, you have to buy everyone pizza. Seems fair, doesn't it? No, we wouldn't do that, obviously, that would not be fair. This is our third and final community forum of a winter series on pressing public issues. We've really benefited and enjoyed informed, constructive and positive conversation. We've seen social agencies, volunteer groups, leaders of faith communities, politicians and just regular people from the community get together and talk about things that really matter, and it's been actually really inspiring and encouraging to realise how much we have in common and how much is already going on. Tonight we come together to talk about the issue of food poverty or food insecurity. Nearly 1 in 5 children in New Zealand are living in what's termed relative poverty, according to a report done by New Zealand Statistics in June 2019. This number rises to 1 in 4 in the case of the Maori population. Though we are a relatively wealthy country, many New Zealanders live with food insecurity or food poverty. This is defined as a lack of access to healthy and nutritious food. And of course, food insecurity has a negative effect, especially on families, on children, on health, and on mental health. New Zealand's Child Poverty Action Group estimated that the weekly cost to feed a person ranges from 29 to 74 New Zealand dollars, depending on age and sex. For a family of 4, that means food costs can average over 400 New Zealand dollars a month on top of other costs like utilities, rent, clothing and education. According to Child Poverty Action Group, about 7% of New Zealanders experienced severe food insecurity in 2008-2009, and 3%, these statistics are all confused, aren't they? I'm looking forward to hearing from the experts on this. And 1/3 of New Zealanders experienced moderate food insecurity at some point. The implications of this, even when dealing with moderate food insecurity, were large. The Child Poverty Action Group reported on families struggling to feed their children, often opting for unhealthy food because it was the cheapest, and even going through garbage to salvage food or foregoing food altogether to make sure their children did not go hungry. So tonight we're going to be hearing from a panel of practitioners and academics. We're also going to be hearing from and talking with our local MP, and we're also going to hear some stories from around the country of different groups that have decided to try and make a difference in this area. So we're going to start tonight with one of those stories. We're going to see a video on the screen of Ben Wakefield, who works for a group called Kaibosh in Paraparaumu. So if the technology is with us, over to Ben.
Whanakwe, Ben Wakefield, thank you for joining us and looking forward to hearing from you about your work with Kaibosh. So could you introduce yourself please briefly and tell us a bit about Kaibosh?
Kia ora tātou, kia ora koe Jonathan. Ko nongatā te maunga, ko rotorua te roto, ko whare runanga te marae, ko tangata o te tiriti te iwi, he Pākehā au, ko Kaibosh tōku mahi, ko Ben Wakefield tōku ingoa. Kia ora. Ben, I work for an organisation called Kaibosh, and we are based in the Wellington region. So about 12 years ago, there was a lady called Robin Langlands, and she was working, volunteering with Women's Refuge. Got a phone call from Wishbone, which is a ready meal producer in supermarkets and BP stations and things like that. And they had some meals which were going to get thrown out. And so they rang her up and said, would you like them? She grabbed them, put them in her freezer, and gave them out over the weekend to Women's Refuge. And each weekend it just kept happening. And then she got more and more contacts, and so her fridge got too small, her freezer got too small, the garage got too small. They started picking up from the markets in Wellington, and then Kaibosh was formed into a charitable trust. And 12 years on, we are in 3 different locations around the Wellington region. We've got one in Petone, one in Wellington, and I run the Kapiti Port of Whenua site. So we're a food rescue organisation, which pretty much means we go and make relationships with food producers and food logistics places, and we ask them for their food that they can't sell and it's still good quality, and then we redistribute it to organisations and charities in our community who work with people in need. Pretty much professional dumpster divers.
Right. Thanks for that. Obviously, you're rescuing food from businesses. Can you tell us a bit about how you go about distributing that?
Yeah, so we have a really transparent, open communication with our businesses and say the food we're going to give out and get from you is not going to be fundraised. They're not going to make money off it. They can't sell it. It's going to those that are working with people already. So we have charities that already work with people, and we understand that part of the issue of what they go through is trying to find resources or funding for food for their clients. So if the food's going to waste, something might as well be done with it. And we sign up those charities. So we work with Birthright, Pathways, Salvation Armies, churches, community groups that do meals once a week. And up here in Kapiti, we have 32 charities that we support, and 27 of those come in each week to take food from us. Yeah.
Wow. So can you give us some sort of ballpark figures? How much food are you recovering, and how many people do you think are on the receiving end of that food? Do you have any idea?
That end of the receiving end is a hard one, because that changes week to week. But in terms of food, we average about 350, somewhere between that, kilograms of food a day that we're able to distribute out. That with something else that's happening nationally, the New Zealand Food Network, which Kiwi Harvest is part of as well, we receive food from them, and we're averaging about 10 tonne a month of food coming in and out of our site here. And over our 3 sites, it's 40 tonne a month in the Wellington region of food.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, do you have any sort of personal experience or story of other people who have been impacted by what you're doing?
Yeah, we get those conversations all the time. We don't deal with individuals who are in need in a sense. We're more of a, I suppose you'd call us a logistics charity, so we deal with those organisations that are doing the face-to-face mahi with people. But we get them coming in, and so we'll get letters from people that they're giving food out to, just in amazement that they're able to get food. One story we had, one of our charities dropping back some boxes that we pack into, and she was telling us that one of the grandmas that she supports was in tears that week because they had an unexpected power bill, being winter. The extra food that they were able to get was amazing. So she was in tears because she's looking after 5 of her grandkids, and it's just hearing those stories and what we're able to do. And we're not a food bank in a sense. We get the food in and out, it's perishable stuff, but that means it's high quality. So we're getting produce, dairy, milk, eggs, meat, and that's 80 for us up here. That's 80% of our food. So we're not storing cans and things. It's all the good stuff. So when we're able to give out parcels to these organisations, they're getting good quality, nutritious food as well. So for us, hearing the stories of the people that are in those positions of need, it's amazing to hear that what they're getting is stuff they wouldn't normally be able to afford to get. So it's really nice to hear those things.
Great, thank you so much. So what advice or wisdom or encouragement would you give to any community or an individual who wants to do something to address food poverty in their area?
Yeah, so food poverty is a massive complex issue. It's not just giving food to people, because as soon as you start thinking it's just giving food to people, you're going to struggle with the dynamics of what poverty is. I'm sure you've got people going to speak on your panel about this that are more knowledgeable than myself. And the first thing is do something. You know, you can talk about food poverty and stuff like that, but if you see a need, actually do something. That's my first thing. And it might be that doing something means you need to ask some questions. You need to go and see some people that are already doing something. I mean, in Dunedin, you've already got people that are like in really good places. You've got people at the university doing stuff. You've got an associate professor at Otago University in the food science department who is physically or actively working on food rescue and food waste as a topic and an issue. That's Miranda Morosa there. You've got Kiwi Harvest, who are another amazing organisation who do what we do, and they're already there. So Susie's there in Dunedin doing that. You've got people that want to do lots of stuff. It's just how do you align together? Because that's the other challenge, doing something, but also doing something with the view that people are already wanting to do stuff together. So don't just go out and do your own thing. Find out what's already happening and work on that. I think that's the best piece of advice for any group or individual that wants to actually do something about food poverty, is working through the complexities of it and not getting overwhelmed, but joining in and partnering with other individuals and other groups that are wanting to do the same thing. And that's how we've succeeded up here. We've just gone to groups that are already doing stuff, and we're working with them and supporting them, and they support us. So it's an open, transparent conversation. I think that's important.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, for your time. Really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your story and Kibosh's work with us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Thank you so much to Ben Wakefield for his time and sharing that with us. Some of you may have noticed a very handsome interviewer. I wasn't actually in two places at the same time. It was a pre-recorded interview, so in case anyone was confused. I'd like to welcome now our panellists up onto the stage. I'd like to take a chair, and really grateful to you all for coming to join us and being willing to sit in the hot seats. I didn't have to do too much arm twisting, and it's really great to have you with us. So, starting with the person closest to me, warm welcome to Susie Townshend from Kiwi Harvest, who's the branch manager, has been working there for 4 years. Give her a round of applause. Dr. Winston Parnell, who is now retired but has over 15 years of research experience as a nutritionist and a great deal of experience in food insecurity. And to her left is KJ Davey from our Food Network, who's a garden facilitator in our local community. And my connection with her is she got our youth group picking vegetables in the community garden and getting apples off people's trees, not stealing them with their permission. And that's been great to be involved in that, and I hope we can do more. And last but not least, on the far end is Dr. Sean Connolly, Senior Lecturer in Geography at Otago, also 15 years of research, and I realise we forgot to give everyone a round of applause. We just gave one Susie. These guys are the professionals, I'm just here to make everyone feel relaxed by making mistakes. Could encourage you when you're talking, guys, to keep the microphone close to your mouth. I wonder first if we can just start with each one of you, maybe a minute or a couple of minutes, if you could just share as we go down the row, just a story from your experience and your work that typifies the reality of food poverty in New Zealand. Give us a sort of idea on a human level of what are the sort of issues we're facing. You happy to go first, Susie?
Yes, I can. Is it on?
Yep.
Hi everyone. So I've been with Kiwi Harvest for 4 years. We started in 2012 in Dunedin. It was food share. Deborah Manning started it. She started it from the back of her car. So she saw 2 articles in the newspaper. One was about dumpster diving, those collecting really good food from dumpsters, from the back of supermarkets, and the other one was about food poverty and children going hungry. She thought, why can we not use these 2 problems and have one solution? And so that's grown into what Kiwi Harvest is today. It was fantastic seeing Ben from Kaibosh, because that's pretty much what we do. We follow their same model. There's a few different models of food rescue, but we follow that one of rescuing this really amazing food and giving it out to the community. And so during COVID, we were all these amazing community groups of which we're part of, we were classified as an essential service because it was recognised that food insecurity was really highlighted during COVID. And through that, we've had some really they're sad stories, and it's great that we can help. So the ones that highlight for me the reality is families who for 3 weeks of the month can pay for food, and then they get their power bill on week 4, and that's their food budget. We know, I guess most of it's anecdotally, that the food budget is the first one to be used because it's the most flexible. It's the one that's not fixed. It doesn't have a fixed cost like rent or power or transport costs, petrol. You have to get to work because you need that money to pay everything else. And so food is the first budget that is dipped into and reduced to pay for all of these other necessities. So that one really highlights it for me, that these families absolutely, they can get by for 3 weeks of the month, but week 4 is when they just need a bit of a hand. But we go to Salvation Army and Presbyterian Support. We collect cafe food that we call ready meals, so the sandwiches, scones, muffins that get donated to us that were made yesterday. And we know that when we go to Salvation Army and Presbyterian Support, where they're dropped off, there's people waiting for them because they know that day they can get a meal.
Great, thanks. Shall we come back to you
Yeah.
a bit later? Great. Thank you so much, Susie. Wilson?
I guess I've retired from the university, but I haven't retired from life. And in the area of Dunedin, which I live in, it's not far from here, there are some people who are food insecure. They're elderly and frail and can't feed themselves very well. And I freely admit to offering what you might call charitable responses, and sometimes I think my kitchen's like a soup kitchen. It's soup that I make and deliver. Just one anecdote, but the other work that more recently I have done in my retirement is to do some consulting with the Auckland City Mission. And I got involved with them because Helen Robinson, who you'll frequently hear on the news, bless her, is a manager there, and she was doing a master's degree, and I helped her set up her project because it was in the area of food security or food insecurity. And I was privileged to be present in Auckland during several periods during Helen's study. And the most salutary experiences are to be around at lunchtime when there's a queue way down the street of people arriving for a meal. And you realise how little they have. But what blew me away was the fact that the staff at the mission knew many of these people, and as you walk past they would address them by name, and that told me something, that these people were coming regularly. This was not a one-off, this was a way of life, that they were having to come to receive food charitably. Now, I'm not going to comment at this point whether I think that's good or bad, but something was being done, and I hugely admire the work that the Auckland City Mission does. A great deal of it is with people who have disabilities of various sorts and mental health issues, which are often ongoing and there's no instant fix. So it's a great need to help. But I would just like to say that this problem in New Zealand is not new, and the first research interest that I had dates back to 1993, and we had a Public Health Commission at the time, which Sir David Skeggs headed, and he was aware that there were problems of reported by headmasters about feeding children in schools. And so we devised a project and I carried it out for the Public Health Commission. It was called Documenting Hunger in Schools, and we asked the head teachers at the schools to report on how many children they thought were hungry, and also to report on other details. And in that way we were able to map the issue in New Zealand, and I can go back to the report and tell you which issues had more problems in which schools, and you probably wouldn't be surprised if you saw it. There was very little problem in the south, I might say, at that time. But I think it's important that we realise that the problem of food insecurity, if you're food secure, you have access to enough food all the time, okay? But the problem of not having access to healthy food all of the time is not new. And so in New Zealand we started looking at it back in the early 1990s, and it was being documented in other ostensibly well-off developed countries in the UK, America and Canada at the same time.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
KJ.
Kia ora. So I'm employed with our Food Network to work with 3 primary schools from our more low decile, more vulnerable communities to help them with their established gardens and cooking programs. So that's my sort of lens on this. So I just have a few tiny wee comments of things that have broken my heart or filled my heart. So right at the start, just working alongside a child and having this child, smile at me and having a conversation, and he smiled at me, and you could just see his teeth were all rotted, and just that kind of implication of these long-term health and issues that we are creating with this food poverty. Just kind of hit me, one of those moments. And then, so all the schools I work with all have the new government school lunch programs. There's 6 schools in Dunedin that are provided lunches on a daily basis. So one passed on wee anecdote I had was one child wasn't eating their lunch one day, and someone sort of said, "What's going on? Why aren't you eating food today?" And that was I'm going to save it for my dinner. Just that situation. Then some positive anecdotes around the school lunches and their implications. So the changes in attendance, being able to go to school because there's going to be food. Anecdotally from the teachers that I touched base with in preparation was, definitely changes. They know that the children's mood and behaviour will be more settled throughout the day, and that their learning will be impacted by these positive decisions that we've made to be able to include lunches. But those school lunches aren't available to all schools or all people in need, so just something to be aware of.
Thank you so much, KJ. Sean.
Kia ora koutou. So I'm at the university in the School of Geography, and one of the privileges I have in my job is to work with some amazing students. And so some of the stories that I'm going to tell here really come from Kitty, who's sitting in the front row, almost Dr. Kitty Cresswell Real. She did some work on how food bank users in Dunedin experience hunger and wanted to give voice to people's experiences. And so some of the quotes from her work, when she asked people, what does hunger mean to you? They say, hunger means being in pain, having to sleep on my stomach because we didn't have any food. My cousin told me that if you sleep on your stomach, then you'll be all good. Just go to sleep like that and you won't be hungry anymore. That's understanding hunger. So really, I think that illustrates the depth of the problem and how intractable it is, where people are developing and sharing these really horrible coping strategies. Other people talk about what is hunger. It's when your brain produces a stink feeling so that it can even affect your mood and thinking, bigger things. You feel hungry, you feel lethargic. You don't want to achieve anything because all you're thinking is, I need food. I feel like that's your body's natural instinct, the way to tell that you need to do something about this. And then if you don't reduce it, it spirals into more things. And so I think that really illustrates how debilitating hunger is. It is that sort of that primal instinct that we need to eat before we can do anything else. And if we're not able to do that, there's no wonder that there's a whole range of other problems and issues that flow on from that in terms of social dysfunction, mental well-being, et cetera, et cetera. People talk about, I think when people haven't got enough to feed themselves, they're looked down upon. They get that downtrodden thing about them. They feel personally downtrodden, and that's another horrible position to be in life. The people are recognizing the loss of dignity that comes with being seen by society as being unable to feed yourself. And I think that's just, again, illustrates just a terrible commentary on our society. Someone else said, hunger's not having eaten anything for 4 days, or knowing that whatever you get has to go towards your daughter or your family before it comes to you. I don't know how to explain it. It's just knowing that you need something, but you can't have it. And you just, it's really heartbreaking thinking about how someone has to repress these feelings of satisfying their own selfish needs to fulfill their, to sacrifice for their family members, and what that does to someone's mental well-being. The last one, so that the hardest thing for a mother and father is when their child asks for food and there is none. After a situation like this, one would wish that he were dead rather than have to experience this again. And so I think that, unfortunately, the number of experiences and stories like that in New Zealand are far too numerous, but I think it sort of paints a picture of the very real crisis that we have collectively allowed to manifest, and illustrates the need to do something about it.
Thank you so much. We'll stay with you, Sean, for the next question, and come back the other way. So you guys have all painted a very, profound picture of the situation. What is behind this? I mean, I know this is a complex situation, but if we've been looking at this sort of situation for at least 30 years and probably longer, what are some of the fundamental things behind this situation? What forces are driving the issue of food poverty for New Zealand?
I think three things, and they're related. First, and it is relatively simple, it's an issue of accessibility. And what accessibility means is having the means to buy safe, nutritious, culturally appropriate food at all times. And so what that means is we need people to have adequate incomes, either through their work situation or through a social welfare system that is able to provide that. So accessibility is one thing, and that's straightforward. Not simple to address, but straightforward. Related to that is the systemic discrimination that prevents people having that accessibility. So there's all kinds of subsets of the population that experience hunger to a greater degree than others. And so that might be sort of around age, around any marginalized groups, disabilities, women, LGBTQ community, Indigenous, Pacifica, Maori, that experience these discrimination and marginalization. And then I think the third one is apathy on the part of those of us that are fed. We've been conditioned, or we bought into these notions of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, the deserving hungry and the undeserving hungry. And that creates a situation where we feel sort of comfortable placing blame on people that can't feed themselves. And we force people to jump through all kinds of hoops in order to access food, whether that's relying on WINS referrals to access food from the food bank, or making people to do budgets, or taking budgeting classes so they can budget the money that doesn't exist, as if that would solve the problem. And we pretend that the charitable sector can address these issues through their really well-meaning efforts and well-intentioned efforts at food redistribution, offering cooking classes or gardening skills, et cetera, et cetera. But at the root of the problem is really the erosion of our sort of collective responsibility to take this issue seriously and to hold ourselves accountable for allowing this to occur.
Thanks, Sean. You
I'm sitting right between two
you.
experts. So.
Well, we would appreciate your point of view, though.
Yeah, it's just simply that unfortunately people who have less income just don't have enough available to maintain that healthy diet. And I think healthy is important to put in there. So, like when you have very limited funds, your choices of buying milk over other options, you can't make those healthy choices. We've all seen the cost of vegetables this last few weeks, and it just makes you kind of go, wow, yeah, healthy food is not accessible for all. And I think that's a really big one. Yeah, it's really multifaceted, as it's been alluded to, and we've got increasing other issues in this country, so increasing living costs and housing costs, and it's all interrelated. Yeah, and also just, unfortunately, the promotion of poor quality food and the cheapness of it is something that could be addressed.
Thank you so much. Winston.
Well, Sean did a brilliant summary, thank you. You used the word accessibility, and I'm going to use a tougher word, lack of money.
Yeah.
It's the economic underpinning, lack of money is the issue. When I described that we became very aware of this issue in New Zealand in the 1990s, there were the benefit cuts of it was 1991. And that's when food insecurity just started to rise. And one indicator of that was the increase in the number of food parcels which food banks found themselves having to supply. So there was a sudden increase, and it was very marked, and we realised that that was a marker of an issue. And over the years, the University of Otago has worked on the amount of money that should be spent if you can afford a healthy diet if you spend about this amount of money per person. And we've tracked it over the years. Now, you can argue that the amounts should be greater or less. However, tracking it over time has been very important. And then you can look at that and say, okay, if you're on a government benefit and you've got housing costs, electricity costs, is there enough left for food? And there isn't. And so benefit costs or benefit levels have been inadequate. And I do acknowledge that they've gone up recently, but then so have housing costs, and it's winter, and so have heating costs. And the government says keep your rooms all at 18 degrees and gives you all this wonderful advice. Well, they don't say go and choose healthy food. They don't say it out loud. There are dietary guidelines, but nobody ever looks at them. So that's an issue. And I think because this is an economic issue, we have to look at policies, and we have to look at it from the top down and the bottom up. And charitable responses, and we've heard some brilliant things tonight, and we know, sitting here, are experts in what we can do to alleviate the problem, but we need to look at the policies which are causing the problem at the top. And I endeavoured in my academic career to do that. But I will be quite honest with you, and since this is totally public, when I wrote reports for the Ministry of Health using data which they had paid me to collect. Now, that means that they did surveys of New Zealanders, and I was a contractor to provide the data, and I was permitted to develop an index of household food security. I did that, and so we were able to monitor the levels of food security and say it was this and that proportion of the population were food insecure, and look at it for different ethnic groups. And when those data were presented back to the Ministry of Health and to the Minister of Health, they didn't really want to know about it. And on 2 occasions, the reports went from Otago University to the Ministry just before an election, and they were conveniently buried, along with some data on alcohol. And since I've been very public about that, I have no hesitation in repeating it. But really what I'm wanting to say is that it's very embarrassing for those in authority to admit that in a country like New Zealand we have people who are hungry. And so it's very difficult to get policy shift to deal with it. So there's enormous and wonderful effort going on at the Band-Aid end, and I do not decry it, and I'm part of it, but I still think we have to shout more loudly at the top level into the government about the issue.
Thank you, Winston. Susie.
I'm not really sure I can add much more to any of that, to be honest. It's exactly as they've said, and it's not an isolated problem. There's so many facets to it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Well, in that case, you can start us off on our next question. Obviously we have some sort of ideas of the sort of things we can do, but is this something that the local community can address, or is it just a band-aid kind of thing we've already sort of said, or is this something that as a local community we can really make a difference in?
It's kind of, I think as a local community there's small things we can do, community gardens, there's community support in other forms that isn't food. So how Kiwi Harvest operate is we are the recipient agencies we give food to are those who offer what we call wraparound services. So food's not their main or their only program. They're offering other forms of support. It might be the likes of North East Valley offer a lot of information around housing and warm homes. It might be having a nurse come up, a community nurse come up once a week so that those who don't have ready access can have access. It might be offering just a social outlet for someone to come and have a meal. And I spoke to Deborah Manning, so she's the founder of Kiwi Harvest. I asked what she had thought, and she mentioned that before you can have a solution, you have to understand how big the problem is, and we don't actually have a really good understanding yet of how big the problem is. There is very little data on the food poverty problem in Dunedin, and while there's probably pockets of it everywhere and everyone's doing some of that research and there is data, it's not collectively in one place at the moment, and so it's very hard to drive a solution when you don't actually know what that baseline problem is, what that data is actually being able to tell us, because we don't have it yet.
Right, thank you. So can you pick up on that issue of data there, Winston? Is it because the data's been buried, or we really don't, we are in the dark completely because we just haven't done the research?
Well, nationally we're not in the dark, but at a local level you're quite right, because and if you want to get sufficient data in every little pocket or little geographic area, you would spend your whole life collecting data instead of doing anything. However, I think that if we understand that this is an issue of poverty, we know the areas of the city where there are people living in poverty, and so we can track that. I want to pick up on your comment that really this is the help that you offer may not seem to directly affect the issue of food insecurity, but indirectly it does by taking care of people, and that's a very important point that you made. I have a colleague, Bonnie, who was working in Nova Scotia, and she was a community nutritionist and went around people's homes. She was working with young mothers, and she had many in quite poor circumstances. And they complained to her that they didn't have enough money for food. And so, first of all, she used to go and say, "Can I look in your cupboards?" And she would pull out what was there and help them to use that creatively. That was one thing. But then she realised what they were spending their money on was disposable nappies. Now, hanging out nappies on a clothesline in Canada when it's minus whatever, Canadian here, is not what they do, and you'll get frostbite. So what Bonnie actually did was organise in Halifax a diaper service. And what it was the mothers put the nappies in buckets, put it at the gate, someone else picked them up, washed them and returned them. They were not disposables but reusables, but they were all washed and returned to them. And that freed up money for food. And what, of course, when you have enough food, then the anxiety levels in the household diminish. We underplay the fact that, well, can I comment that there's a lot of women here tonight. I'm thrilled there's some men, but women more often bear the burden of feeding families, and there are many solo families. There are solo families with men, but more with women. And the anxiety that they bear is not conducive to good health. So creative things that we can do to help may not be directly providing them with food. It may be freeing up money for food in other ways. So I think that we can at a local level think creatively about that, and every one of us can be part of helping with it.
Thank you, Winsome. Any thoughts on this, KJ?
Yeah. So locally, we can all demand a little bit more from our council and our Southern District Health Board, I think. We need policies that promote healthy eating within our communities, and we need better education. So that is maybe one way thing that we can expect and demand, and it could be increased. In our communities, there's totally room for all of us to be involved, and I know, I'm definitely seeing that in my own community. I'm from North East Valley, so and working alongside them in food security projects. So schools, if you have a relationship with school, or if you want to ensure that there is space to work in with them with their gardens and support them with their gardens, and it could be, there's lots of potential there for those relationships, and I'm volunteering at my local school trying to establish a stronger relationship with their community garden. We always hold up community gardens as shining lights, but sometimes they're struggling as well, so they do need us to be involved, and whether better systems can be set up that their produce goes to community pantries and goes directly to food boxes that are happening at a local scale, like the Kai Share that uses food from this food system. And just a recent example, I've been put in contact with Ronnie Bogle in Mosgiel, and you might have seen him in the media. He's a passionate local that has been finding funding himself, because the school's not funded for lunches, but he has been finding funding and making lunches available at Silverstream School in Mosgiel, and it's just, if you need it that day or that week, you can sign up for it. You don't need to prove. And he's been making wonderful lunches there and wanting to connect that to a garden, so he needs support out there. On an individual scale, we could all bring more food and share it around our neighbours and build stronger communities. So.
Thank you, KJ.
The community food harvest, our food network.
So, since I've got the microphone, I'll repeat what you just said. Our food network runs a community fruit harvest, so if people have access, or trees with excess fruit that they don't know what to do with, or are unable to harvest it, we've got a team of volunteers that will come out and pick it and put it to good use. I guess just sort of building on all of that, I think we can point to all kinds of really inspiring initiatives and organizations and individuals that are making a real difference in their communities, and that needs to be celebrated. But the issue is that people are so overworked and overstretched trying to get these initiatives off the ground that they're unable to lift their head up above and see the potential for connections across projects. And I think that's where something that KJ mentioned is really valuable. If we could push the DCC, the Southern District Health Board, sort of public health agencies to establish and to put resources into something like the Food Policy Council, where food is puts food front and center in our minds every day when people are making decisions, that takes some of the burden off these individuals that are often doing it on volunteer time, trying to cope with what I'll call the failings of our society. Food is central to what we do every single day. There's no reason it shouldn't be the Department of Food in the DCC or the Southern District Health Board or some combination thereof. And there's all kinds of examples around the world of places doing this. In Canada, Food Secure Canada ran a program over 3 years. There were 3,500 individuals in church halls just like this all across the country that together put together sort of a whole series of policy agendas to address the food crises that Canada is facing. There's no reason we can't be doing something like that here.
Thank you, Sean. Right, that's our final question for the panel before we have some questions from the floor. And I'm going to be strict on time for this because we're pushing the time a little bit. So you have 30 seconds to give us either one, where's my thing? One key societal or attitudinal change or one key national policy change that you think would make the biggest difference. So your 30 seconds starts now, Sean.
This is something that Kitty is really keen on. We need to take the right to food seriously. Food is a human right, and we like to, I think, nationally, to think of we are a land of plenty, we're a massive food exporter, and so we pretend that food hunger is impossible in New Zealand, and clearly that's not the case. If we took the right to food seriously, we would by default have to address all of these things in a much more meaningful way.
Brilliant, and right on time. Thank you, KJ.
So, again, yes, healthy food should not be a privilege, it is a right. We produce so much quality food, enough for 50 million that we're exporting quality produce and importing sugars and processed food. And that quality food is, because of trade agreements, is at export prices. So we've got ourselves in a bad situation. I'd like to see change at the government level as well, whether it's taxation, sugar tax, no GST on fruit and vegetables, there needs to be change.
Great, thank you, KJ.
I'm into that, and eat seasonally.
Sorry, can you repeat that, Winston?
Well, it was amen to both of these. Amen to both the previous speakers, and eat seasonally.
Eat seasonally, right, sorry. I thought you said eat seeds daily, and I was confused. That's right, thank you. Susan.
Absolutely, 100% agree with all of that, and again spoke to Deb and asked her opinion on this, but she mentioned specific benefits to those in that lowest income bracket, to specific benefits to those who need it. So it might be different ways of raising the level of income in that bracket, be it raise the minimum tax bracket, give them other incentives, but specifically for the group that actually need it.
Great. Thank you so much, panel. That was really fascinating and very helpful. We're able to have some questions from the floor, Greg? Yes. Are we ready? If you have a question, please raise your hand and the microphone will come to you. And if you could just very briefly introduce yourself and make your question, you can direct it to the whole panel or to a particular individual. So over to you.
Hi, I'm Marion Maxwell. I'm with East Torrey Church, and we're just upgrading and sorting out our community food bank. I have previously worked in a food bank in Rangiora for a year, and I'm also doing a little bit at the Mosgiel one. What I would like to know is, can we educate, or how can we educate the public when they're donating food, that it's all not about cans and packets? The best thing I've heard from you guys tonight is the emphasis on healthy food, because as working at a food bank, I really struggled with giving people 6 loaves of bread, 20 cans, 10 packets, and like the time they walked away, all they had basically was 2 real packets of meat and any fresh fruit and yogurt that came in from the likes of a Kiwi Harvest thing. So to me, there's people out there donating, like the supermarkets have just had a $20 donate to the food banks, but I unwrapped those parcels and you didn't eat them, like they're not real food. So to me it's like the people that need the food need the best food.
Thank you for that question. Anyone like to respond to that?
I can say one thing. It is this is something we come across quite a lot as Kiwi Harvest. We get fantastic donated food. We're from bigger organisations, and I guess there's two things. One is you have to sometimes look at it from the point of view that it is a meal to someone who didn't have anything to start with, while you say while for us it's not nutritious. We do sometimes have to be careful that it is still a meal to someone. In terms of education for the public, we've done these fantastic drives or the Rotary Clubs of Dunedin have done them for us a couple of times with the supermarkets. And instead of just asking people to donate, we actually gave suggestions. So we said, here's the 10 or 15 items that are really worthwhile. Cereal and breakfast items are just gold, because they're a meal. A child can make themselves a bowl of cereal. They don't need an adult around. There's no fire risk of them hurting themselves making cereal or toast. So we gave suggestions. We suggested cereals. We suggested canned goods like baked beans and spaghetti. Again, they're a meal. It is slightly different from a nutrition-rich meal, but it is still food in someone's belly, and it's quite a hard. It's a hard sort of message to feel good about. Is doing that.
You put that well. I guess the thing is that taking a food parcel, that should be a short-term measure, an emergency measure. It's not a long-term fix for food insecurity. Don't kid yourself, it just isn't. If someone's having to come to a food bank repeatedly, it's an indication of a very serious underlying economic deficit. We should have food banks because there are emergencies, but we shouldn't fuss too much if it doesn't look perfect. However, there's another thing you can do, and that's you can ask people to donate money, and then in the food bank you buy a range of foods. And then of course there are the new kinds of food banks that are being set up in the North Island that I've heard about, where it's like a mini supermarket, and people who have no food can go and choose what they actually need. And there's a bit of dignity to that too, because they get some choice. We're very inclined to think that if we're well off we can have choice, and if we're not we can't. Think about that one.
Just at a small local scale, so I've had the privilege with our food network of helping people harvest excess produce they have in their backyard, and then I've been the lucky person to drop it off at various food banks or local food shares or community pantries, and seeing that food be, it's just something simple we could all do in our neighbourhoods, and it is always really well received. So I think that's a big one.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Do we have another question? Gentleman on his hand up. That's great.
You know me, Jonathan.
I know you, but you can introduce yourself, Selwyn.
Okay. I'm Selwyn Yeoman. I'm a retired Presbyterian minister, among other things. This question, I'm not sure if the recent report on the two big supermarkets has impact on food security issues or not. But when I came as minister to Mosgiel at the end of 1984, there were 5 orchards on the Taieri Plain and I think about 7 market gardens. And by the time I left Mosgiel in 1985, they were all gone. And subsequently, when we've had earthquakes or other natural events, a lot of local food, well, we haven't had local food available. Because it all gets carted from another part of the country. And I remember talking to one of their orchardists, and he said it is so hard because the supermarkets just close us out. And that's one of the reasons that they've shut down. So I'd be interested to hear your comments about the importance of having locally sourced food for food security.
There's quite a movement, I think, in Dunedin, which is still active and is looking at sustainable food in this region. And so there are people who share that concern. And you're quite right, we're getting more and more food bought from other regions and not locally grown, which we should decry. However, the lifestyle that many of us lead mean that we want to go to the supermarket once a week. And so supermarkets hold the power and need a range of food. So the general cost of food in the supermarket is an issue. So going back to your first point about the fact that there's only 2 supermarket chains and not enough competition, the prices are too high. So the issue of that stranglehold of just the 2 chains is real. But the second point is the related one of whether we should have locally produced food. And I think that has advantages because it involves people in the production of food and that keeps them healthy in a lot of other ways. We can't grow everything down here, but we can do a pretty good range. And it is a concern whenever we squeeze out local production of foods, and it's very hard then when food production gets moved to one area to make it healthy. You get bugs and all sorts of things. So eating locally and sustainably is important. But the supermarket bit is just the general cost of food in the supermarkets, and it's too high. Or higher than it should be.
Yeah, I think there's a paradox there, right? Cheap food isn't the answer, because with cheap food, we won't have anyone producing that food. People growing our food, producing our food, have to be able to make a livelihood. And so we're really stuck here. And I think ultimately it comes down to what was said earlier. It's an income issue. It's not about the cost of food. Sure, the supermarket duopoly, squeezing out competition, driving down prices that are paid to producers and jacking them up for consumers is not a healthy or secure food system, and that should change. But we have to also think about how we are effectively rewarding those people that are going to grow our food and value that food, because that's critically important as well.
Thank you. Great question, Selwyn, and I do know exactly who you are. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Thank you at the front. Just wait for the microphone and then we can all hear you. And I'm afraid this is why I didn't want to mention Selwyn by name, because now you're going to feel left out because I don't know your name. So, gentleman at the front.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Tihima Makware. Mine's not really a question, but mine's basically around some of the things that I know that are available here in Dunedin. I think one thing that people here in Dunedin, there's ample seafood here in Dunedin. So there's like an abundance of food that you can gather and forage from here in Dunedin. That's, and maybe it's around people don't have the knowledge of how to get those things, but within, I know because I'm a Māori, there's so much food here in Dunedin that you could actually forage for, and so I don't think those skills have been shed because we're too risk averse these days around some of those things. We're too scared to, a neighbour might see me cooking orokis or puha, you can't afford that. But there's so much food here, but it's like we're not educated on how to do those things. Because you could basically live off the sea here, it's everywhere. I'm a diver, so I'm just saying that there's a lot of other avenues outside of here in Dunedin that we could actually utilise that doesn't seem to be utilised properly.
Thank you for your question. Would anyone on the panel like to respond to that?
I'll just say, I think that relates to how we might value food, and I think that's a really important point. We need to sort of value all the types of food that is out there and that's available. And part of the problem is, I think, is we've undervalued some of those foraging activities, those harvesting kind of activities, and a lot of that knowledge has been lost, and we certainly need to build that up. Certainly can contribute to addressing it.
Anyone else want to? No? Thank you. Question in the middle there, Greg. is how Greg gets his exercise.
Hello, I'm Nikki Carruthers and I'm just a community member. I was just wondering about people's thoughts about poverty of time and poverty of skill and how to use food. And that, you know, sometimes people are looking, they're spending so many hours working, they don't have the time or they don't have the skill to be able to make nutritious food from very little.
Thank you for that question.
I think you've raised very real issues, and before we criticise others, we should always think of what else they have to do besides prepare food. And particularly in one-parent households, that's a huge responsibility. So being time poor is an issue. And I know that now that I'm retired, I cook differently to when I was working, because I can now do everything from scratch. I've got the time to do it. It wasn't a luxury I had in my working life, and I think that's very, very real. The skills bit, well, we old people remember when, of the female variety, when we went to school we all had cooking lessons. By the time I was 12 I could cook a meal for a family. The government in its wisdom decided that they would teach food technology, and I'm not sure what they teach, but it wasn't about how to prepare food. The skills have gone. And I regret that, and that does push up the price of feeding a family. And means that you are forced to buy food where some of the preparation is done for you, which costs more. And sometimes just not having the skills does contribute to the amount that you have to spend. However, for many people that won't solve very much, but for many of us that's an underlying issue that would make a difference. Thank you for pointing it out.
I have to say, like, two things with that. I 100% agree. The rise of the likes of My Food Bag and HelloFresh, because they are really convenient, but they are more expensive. I've had them before and loved them because I don't have to think. It's just and it takes half an hour, but they are more expensive. But then also on the skills thing, I thought it was quite interesting. We've had what happened over the last couple of years, and unfortunately it's stopped for the moment, but we were donating food, or giving food to Project Bruce in Milton, and they had a fantastic arrangement with the correctional facility there, where they were making school lunches for about 70 or 80 lunches a day from food that we'd donated to Project Bruce, and they were donating it back to the schools. And the schools had identified the children that would benefit from those meals. And they now have all the lunch in schools, in all those primary schools. But to the skills one, a lot of the men there couldn't boil water. They didn't know how to. And over the course of the year or so that they were preparing these school lunches, had immense pride that they were able to actually, they could probably come out and provide for their families. They could make a meal for their children. They learned a whole heap of skills of not just how to prepare food, but what food actually was, what was nutritious, what could make a lunch, what a healthy lunch sort of looked like. And yeah, so they had a fantastic feedback from the guys out there. And yeah, we're hoping to do something else, a different type of project, but still revolving around food. But yeah, it's just a very real thing. Yeah.
Amazing. We can't always do it in prison. One of the best things I ever saw was many years ago in Auckland, in West Auckland. A community set up a community house, and they had food which they collected through, it wasn't called Kiwi Harvest or somewhere in those days, but they had donated food. The mothers in the area who didn't have the means to give their children school lunches came along to this community house. They had donated food, they made a lunch, and they took it to school and gave it to their own children. They learned as a group how to make a lunch, they taught each other with a little bit of help, and the dignity of taking a lunch to their own children had to be seen to be believed. I've never forgotten it.
Thank you very much. One more question, or if there is one, or we'll move on to the next segment. One question.
And I'm about to finish my nutrition degree. Is this working? Yeah. Do you have any recommendations on how to use my degree for the current climate and like how to be effective in this issue.
What a wonderful question.
I think we'll have a conversation over a cup of tea. Good question.
Sounds like you just might have found yourself a new mentor. Great, well, let's have a round of applause, please, for our panel. We may have time at the end for a few more questions, but if you'd like to take a seat now, you can take a breath and relax a bit. And we're going to have our second video now of the evening, and this is my friend Val from
Kia ora Jonathan, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Valerie Marie ngā o te reitua tōku ingoa. He uri au tēnei no Ngāti Whātua ki te Kaipara, so from the Dargaville area up in the north, and ki te taho o tōku Karaua no Kaipohe, so in the middle of the north, and my father's from the Cook Islands, so kia ora koutou. I'm a mother of four with an amazing husband and two beautiful grandchildren. And we've been part of Papatuanuku Pukeri Marae for about 12 years. And so we believe that, you know, that God's brought us here for a purpose, and we absolutely love it.
That's wonderful. Could you tell us a bit more about the marae and the story behind its distance?
Yes, so Papatuanuku Pukeri Marae was formerly, first and foremost, a marae development program that pulled together kaumātua and kuia from around the Mangere area. And one of the things that they had recognised was poverty. You know, a lot of our Māori tāne rangatahi that were hanging around the steam train parks, just up to no good, and just like Princess Te Puia, how she walked the areas to reach out to those in need. And so Mere Karaka Knight, she was from Ngāti Porou, but she was a very staunch advocate for marae development, for Māori restoration of te reo me ona tikanga. And so she, back in the 70s, they had this discussion about setting up Papatuanuku Pukeri Marae. It originally first started as a training where they were teaching te reo, marae tikanga, ngā mahi toi, which is Māori arts, in a way of bringing people together. And so together as a collective, they had established Papatuanuku Pukeri Marae. So it's been in existence since 1984. With, I guess, when we look at food insecurity today, that they had a vision of what food insecurity would look like today way back then. So the whole purpose of the marae was to establish a garden. And the whenua is made up of, or the land is made up of 2.4 acres, and the 1.2 of that was turned into marakai or food. And so this was not only that she do all the arts and bringing together people to identify, you know, understand who they are and where they come from. She utilised the garden or the mana as a vehicle to connecting people. And so the garden has been, in existence since 1984, and today we start to see an abundance of it. And in reflection of the COVID, we've seen the benefits of that vision way back then and how it's helped our people today. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. So obviously the marae's always had a sort of history of being involved in food and seeing food as a really central thing. Could you say something more about why food was seen to be so central? And okay, it seems very relevant now, but was it so relevant back then, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had, you know, in our community, we had, you know, a high number of You know, statistics on crime, stealing, and just, you know, we had a high population of our Māori males sniffing glue, and, you know, that was pretty much their kai. And so when Nanny Mere had reached out, she would literally walk the streets, and if she saw them, she would grab their hand and bring them up to the marae. This is the way that she engaged with them, and so she connected them to the marae. She had already seen that our people were struggling, not only for food but other things, but this was one of the ways that this was probably one of the reasons and the purposes as to why the Mara Kai was the vehicle. But, you know, gardening is quite soothing. You know, we operate on 6 guiding principles for growing pure food. We call that hua parapore. So we look at the word hua parapore. It's the removal of contaminants to ensure that we have pure foods. But it is also a korowai or a korowai of excellence in the way that we ensure that if we look after the lands, then we know that the lands will look after us. So they had that vision way back then, but over the last 5 years, we've become validated as Indigenous growers of Mara Kai.
Very good, thank you. So can you tell us, obviously you've got the garden and the community around that and the food you produce there. Is there anything else that the marae does in terms of addressing food poverty that you can tell us about?
Yes, so the marae has multiple programs, and if we reflect back on our arrival to the marae, we felt we were led by the Spirit in terms of what were the needs of our community, and that was important to us. We valued what were the needs of our community, and so it's, you know, we have things, it's not only about food, it's also being able to feed the spirit. So when our wairua and our spirits are well, then other things start to pan out. You know, we get healthy families, we start to get healthy bodies, our spirits are strengthened, and then we have this, you know, we have this whole person that has come through a journey of what we call orangatanga, which is well-being. And so the marae has created this korowai, which is a cloak that embraces not only kai, but te reo programs, education, you know, marae experiences for all people. And just this term, we had 780 children come to the marae, experience the mokowhiri process, and then just different workshops that inform how we would look after the whenua, how we would look after our environment. And so the garden plays a really big part in that. So the kids actually think that we always talk to them about they're going to come to Butterfly Creek, because Butterfly Creek is quite a popular attraction for children. But it was quite prevalent that a lot of our children thought that vegetables came in plastic bags. And so when they had the opportunity to walk through the Mara, you know, there was this joy, you know, getting their hands dirty, that whole sensory learning of what food is. So with all of that happening, we've also got what we call the Kai Ika project, and the Kai Ika project is a partnership agreement between Papatūānuku Marae, OBC, now the Moana Fisheries, Sanford's and Scott Seafoods. And what we do in that project, and we've been doing it over 3 years, is that we rescue fish heads and fish frames. So the fish heads would generally be biffed, but for many of our people, it's what we call chiefly food, or rangatira kai. It's 150,000 kgs has been diverted over the last 3 years to our communities. It's fed the multitudes of families who would come to the marae and collect these fish heads. Part of that is about respecting, you know, the kaimoana that we're receiving by feeding our community, and then the next part is getting in really good people like Peter Gordon to teach our families other ways of utilising this fish and being able to put food on their table. So this is only just in Tāmaki Makaurau, just in Auckland. We're feeding marae, we're feeding churches, we're feeding community, and we are rescuing about 1,250 kgs a week. That's a lot from different sources, but organisations such as Moana are willing to participate in this project so that it helps us to tackle food insecurity. I love the Kaika project because it reminds me of Jesus Christ, who fed the multitude with fish and bread alone. Kaika brings so much hope, love and joy to our communities. It's not only about coming to rescue these fish and being able to feed the people, but the people are connecting to a place where they feel comfortable, where they feel that there is no judgment, where they feel that they can actually volunteer and say, oh, I'd love to volunteer. And also looking at another product that we could develop to help sustain the project, and that's to look at a fish emulsion that can also go into our gardens because it's like a superfood, but it's also going to create employment for many of our whānau that are also struggling with employment, especially those who are incarcerated, who are in prison, that probably wouldn't get a second chance, very rarely. But these are opportunities that we want to create to give people hope and see, that they are worthy to participate in our marae project.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That sounds extraordinarily exciting. Great. So my last question is, what advice or wisdom or encouragement would you give to any community who want to do something to address food poverty in their community?
Yeah, definitely encouraging our organisations to grow their own kind, especially, our churches. We have a lot of whānau that come to church, having a garden behind our church, it's bringing whānau together. That's probably one key thing. And then the other key thing is that if you've build relationships with your local fishing boating clubs. What do they do with their fishings? Do they generally chuck it overboard, or could we potentially rescue that for people that would appreciate it? That would probably be my advice. It's, gardening is not easy, especially on a big scale. And one of the things that we've managed to do is to believe that we are vessels that are being used to bring love, hope and joy. So a lot of the things that we've done on the marae has been because God has used us. We believe that He will bless us, and He has. He's blessed us with many people that we continue to lift up, to encourage through the garden, through the Kaika project. So if there is some words of wisdom, is get a garden started in the backyard, bring your communities together, feed the people, grow the abundance. So that would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Val. Really appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
You're welcome. Happy day. All the best. God bless you all.
Next guest who we're going to hear from tonight is Ingrid Leary, our local MP. So if you'd like to come up, welcome Ingrid. Can we have a round of applause, please? And before we get to business, I'd just like to acknowledge that Ingrid's come to all of our community forums. Really appreciate your willingness to be available to us and to be part of these events. And appreciate you've got plenty of things on your plate, and we really value your time and you being here. And I personally value your support of these events that we put on. So just wanted to acknowledge that in front of everybody.
I wouldn't have been watching the Olympics. I would have been at the British High Commission having a whisky night. I'd much rather be here, actually.
I don't know, that sounded pretty good. We're doubly honoured then, I think. So, welcome Ingrid, and thank you for being here. I wonder, before we ask you for your response to what you've heard tonight, I wonder if you want to share yourself. Do you have any experience of food poverty yourself, or of encountering these issues in the community? What's your personal experience of this as an issue?
Thank you for having me, and nice to see lots of familiar faces in the audience, and thank you so much to the panellists for a really insightful conversation. I learned a new word on the weekend called keynote listener. I was at the Festival for the Future up in Wellington. It was my third time, which is this amazing festival where young people, our rangatahi, reimagine the future, and it's incredibly inspiring to be around them and to hear what they want, which is in many ways so different from what our generations have wanted, and it gives me great hope. But a keynote listener is where you design an evening and you invite someone like myself up for a couple of minutes, but basically they're really there to listen and hear the issues and hear some of the solutions come from the community. So I've been doing a lot of keynote listening tonight. In terms of my own experience, I haven't personally experienced food insecurity. I know that my dad did growing up. He talked about when they would eat sops for breakfast, and some of you may be old enough to know what sops are. Apparently it's a bread dipped in milk with sugar on it, and that was kind of the poor person's Weet-Bix. So there was that, and interestingly, when I lived up in the Pacific, I lived in and worked in Fiji for about 5 years. I've done a lot of work up there and lived in subsistence communities. And one thing that subsistence communities are not poor on is food, and I can go into that a bit later. But I think there's been a lot of discussion tonight that goes back to how we value food and the way that we've commoditized food, which I think we need to flip on its head. In terms of just in this electorate, during the campaign last year, one of the probably the most memorable times on a street corner where I encountered, I do encounter a lot of people who have really a lot of big challenges around just being able to get through day to day. But this particular chap had become blind quite recently, so only over a few years. It was before COVID. His home helper hadn't been around, and we were just about to leave the street corner, and I sort of thought I heard someone yelling or waving. I couldn't really see, and we went over to the fence, and it took him quite a while to make his way down the stairs, and we waited there for him, and then he said, "Could you please help me? I haven't eaten anything for 2 or 3 days." And he hadn't been able to help himself. His caregiver hadn't been around. He didn't have a cell phone because he'd run out of credit, and he was really, really hungry. And a couple of our volunteers, we gave them some money, and they went down to the main street, and I think it was at Tukanakai, can't remember, they went to buy him up. We thought we'd better get him a hot meal, and they were going to donate the meal, and then a couple of people that were waiting for their meals also donated meals, and we ended up having sort of 5 or 6 meals that we could put in the freezer. He was probably going to be sick of falafel and lamb things by the end of that week. But so it was a really moving experience, both in terms of the need that he had and also the community's incredibly immediate and generous response. And as a little aside, Grant Robertson was down last week. I was with him at the opening of the new fancy international hockey, what do you call it, pitch? No, hockey turf at King's High School. And I just loved hearing him talk about how rich our community is. And I knew that he really meant it. And when I think about food poverty, I don't like the word food poverty because there is a stigma for those who we think we're talking about, but it's a bit like disability. To me, the poverty is in the society that has enabled people to not have access to food. The poverty is in the way that we are collectively responding. But because of the way people relate to the word poverty, I still prefer the word insecurity. So that would be one of my other ones. The other one is my son goes to Bathgate. We have breakfast programs there. We are one of the healthy lunches, which I'm really grateful for. I love the fact that it means that children who have less access to food are not marginalised in that environment. It's very normal. Sometimes my son will say, no mum, I don't want breakfast here, I want Weet-Bix at school. And I say, well, we've got Weet-Bix. And he goes, no, I want to eat them at school. And then when he eats them at school, I've discovered that they don't have sugar, and he doesn't demand sugar, whereas at home he does. So that's pretty cool. There's also the community pantry there, and I see quite a lot of movement at that community pantry. I think having access to food that's available anonymously and where people can help themselves, and that dignity that we need to have is really important.
Great, well thank you so much for sharing that. So, have you heard anything tonight that's been new to you or something surprising, or did you know it all already?
A politician never knows it all, of course. I think there was a lot of problem definition, and I think we are all aware of the problem. Some of the food for thought, if you like, for me, is around how we can enable people who access donated food better choices. That idea that there's a kind of an assumption that people who can afford have choice and people who can't afford don't get choice. I think that's a really compelling thing to percolate on. I think that, what else is, I made quite a few notes, I'll just have a look. The fish heads thing was really interesting to me. Because I lived in Fiji, my family at Pacifica, that was one of the things we did when we got back, was we saw that salmon heads are something like $2 instead of buying a piece of salmon for about 15. So it's really good to hear that kind of model being used, and we would cook salmon heads all the time. It's not so much that I was surprised, but I think there are two really different issues here that are very interrelated, and then there's a whole lot of other ones as well. One is, for me, is around food insecurity, and one is around nutritional insecurity. And they are related, but they are distinct. And I think I absolutely take the point that it's really important in the very immediate need to be able to put food into people's bellies. But I see food as something that has a community element, a social element, a spiritual element, a nutritional element. And if I can just briefly speak to those, certainly in Indigenous cultures and in the way that my family lives and my extended family and the time in the Pacific, is that food is very central to all of that. And the spiritual element for me, when I say that, I mean it in the broader sense of the word, not religious, but really around kind of connection. Food gives us that connection to other people, and growing food gives us that connection, eating food together. And I find it really bizarre that we have commoditized food so much that we sort of trade with food, that some people don't have enough, some people have too much, that you can donate food and you still don't have a face-to-face relationship in that beautiful exchange that is possible when we're sharing food together as people. And then also from a nutritional perspective, and I guess spiritual as well, I personally follow Ayurveda. I'm a yoga teacher and meditator, and I follow Ayurveda, which is sort of like Chinese medicine, but it's a 5,000-year-old Indian tradition, and we say that food is medicine, and I absolutely believe that we are what we eat. I come from a family of Western doctors, so probably a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. But if we could get our nutritional levels up for everybody, and this is people who have access to money as well, and actually start to eat properly, I think we would find so much benefit in terms of our health system, in terms of also climate. We haven't really talked a lot, we've touched on climate tonight, but the crossover between food security and climate security is absolutely fundamental. And we know, Albert Einstein told us that the number one thing we can do for the climate is eat a plant-based food, a plant-based diet. I think we really need to get serious about that. I eat a plant-based diet because I can afford to. But we need to be able to make it affordable for everybody to be able to get that nutrition. And we know the educational, I don't need to preach to the converted. There are just so many spin-offs from people eating properly, and there is such a deficit when most of the things that we see in our supermarket, even in the first few lanes, are made of, I think, three things. One of them, the huge one, is salt, and then corn and something else. And they look different, but they're all the same thing. And they're nutritionally,
Okay, yeah.
terrible.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So the opportunity for your questions in just a minute. I've got one more question because I've got the microphone. Sorry, folks. So what we heard from our panelists tonight really was that while there are wonderful initiatives at the local level and we should all be involved in those and those make a difference to individuals, but that there is a fundamental structural issue that there is something wrong with our society that we as individuals can't change. And so there needs to be, I guess our mechanism for changing that in our society is the government. And so there needs to be some sort of government interference in the structure to change things for what they are. So I appreciate that you're not the Prime Minister, and even the Prime Minister's power is a lot more limited than I think most of us give her credit for. But what do you think the government needs to do about this?
So if you've been at these talks before, I may have said it before, but I think that I followed Peter Drucker, the management expert, who said that culture eats strategy and structure for breakfast. And what we need, I think, fundamentally is a cultural change, but the structures are what will enable the cultural change. And that cultural change is obviously about reducing inequality, and also finding the mana and the richness in contributing to others and serving others. So we have, we have put on high this value of selfishness and profit ahead of what we can do to be a collective, and I absolutely believe that. In Fiji there's a concept, vakaveti, which means it's the Fijian way, but it can also mean just enough. And actually, if you have more than just enough, everybody will come and live off you anyway, so you end up with just enough. So it's kind of that's the subsistence. That is the subsistence way. It's a very natural, a natural self-selecting way that people organise themselves. And as I said, you don't really see a lot of food poverty, although there is nutritional poverty in the urban centres. So for me, it's about reducing inequality, and that does mean doing many of the things that we are trying to do, like food in schools. By the end of 2021, 25% of our schools will have that program, and I think that's going to be 964 schools in Kura. So that will expand. It is about trying to get the living wage and lifting minimum wages, lifting the benefits. You've all probably heard of those things, but to me they are still, in a way, tinkering with what is a fundamentally flawed economy. And I don't think with climate change that we can keep tinkering. We have to actually be genuine about getting to a circular economy. And that's not a left-wing or a right-wing concept. That is simply about saying that we look at social profit, we value social profit, that we have triple bottom lines, that all government can do really. We can't do the work, but what we can do is use the levers. So it's carrot and stick, pretty basic. We're trying to do it with climate. Climate's easier because we can attempt to quantify carbon credits. We should be able to do it with inequality as well. And so I'm a huge believer of applying the Living Standards Framework, doing that in a way where we value across government agencies benefits, like when you keep a child in a home for X number of years, what does that look like in terms of their education? If they're in a warm home, if they're getting fed, how can we value that? How can we then apply that across to other government agencies so that we actually get cross-government working? And the game changer from where I sit, I can't do too much apart from, of course I'm a backbencher, I can't do that much, but if I was Minister of Finance, you can do carrots and sticks. But if we can start with government procurement, so government contracts, all of those billions of dollars, it's like 30 billion or something every year that we spend on procuring, let's get serious about rewarding those companies that pay their people properly, that treat the environment properly, that provide, if they're a cafe in a hospital, that provide nutritional food for the patients that we're trying to fix. I mean, it's pretty crazy when you see some of the hospital food. We need to get serious about doing that, and that means that we have to undo the bureaucracy that's there. We have to actually look at providing more implementation resource around not only just upskilling people, which we've been doing with free trades training and all of that, but actually looking at how do we get start up social enterprises to be able to implement some of this stuff, and how do we enable them to win government contracts so that they get the experience so they can scale up, so it's not the same big international companies that are taking our funds offshore. And we need to get serious about it and break those contracts up into small contracts, and it will take a massive culture shift in the ministries, but we are starting to see opportunities for it, and I think one of the real opportunities around the Māori health providers, because they are going to be by Māori for Māori, and they will be at arm's length, so they will be able to take risks and prove that they are going to be able to do stuff that we've never ever been able to crack as central government.
Great.
Sorry
Thank
for my
you.
long answers, but you've got me on my passion project here.
Well, thanks for that. Have we got any questions from Ingrid from the floor? Just raise your hand and... Oh, I thought you were all itching here. Oh, there's one at the front.
Within your culture share, do you recognise food as a human right? And if not, why not?
Oh, absolutely, it's a human right. You know, without food, you die. So absolutely, we have to have a human rights-based approach. I think, though, that we're not going to be able to achieve that if we keep believing that individual units and individual people are the way through. If anything, COVID should have taught us that we need to think and act collectively, and that what happens in a little part of corner of China or some other part of the world has an absolute direct impact on us. And we really need to start looking at our supply chains and looking at the human rights issues through our supply chains, know where our clothes come from, know what the climate, the carbon imprint is from everything that we do, where our food's growing. Slow food, as you say, grow locally. Even cooking your own food. I know from a nutritional aspect, for example, when you cook food, it gives your digestive juices enough time to get the right enzymes ready to do the right thing in your body. You don't get that if you go to McDonald's or if you're buying a pre-packaged meal from somewhere. So we've got some real fundamental clues coming from nature to tell us how we ought to be living in order to be our best selves, and we're ignoring them and doing the opposite.
Thank you. Question over there. Sorry, I should have said that was Kitty Creswell-Rio, who is Sean Conley's star PhD student, who told him everything that he knows tonight. So please introduce yourself before you give the question.
My name's Rosemary. I was wondering what you think about the global free trade deals that we're stuck in and signed up to by both sides of the government. What's your opinion about them in relation to food?
Sure. I sit on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and what's been really interesting on that Select Committee to me is the level of secrecy that these trade deals are negotiated under, and often when they see the light of day it's kind of a done deal. I do feel optimistic though, because I think that there is a genuine willingness and intentionality from our government now about values-based trade. And that's tricky because we have major reliance on particular countries, and in order to be able to express our values we need to be secure as well, and so we need to diversify our trade. And I think that the way through that is to have different coalitions with different countries, so not always aligning with the same countries, have different coalitions with different countries so that we can continue to express our independence. And we need to be very clear what our deal breakers are. I am really interested in the treaty clause in the international deals, and have done some work looking at how much genuine consultation has gone on with tangata whenua for them to be satisfied that that is going to safeguard Māori business but also Māori values, not just because I'm concerned for tangata whenua, but because actually those values impact on a lot of the things that we've talked about tonight. And I think that the sooner we can sign a few of the trade deals with some of the imminent ones on the horizon, the better off we will be in order to be able to assert some of the things that we need to around human rights and food security and all of those things from our trading partners. But clearly the more that we can produce at home and the more we can rely on ourselves, particularly in a COVID environment, and particularly with borders that are shaky and we don't know whether they're going to open or close, I think the better off we'll be. What I'd like to see us looking at is obviously higher value food products that we export offshore. We want value, not volume. And I think we've got opportunities, even here in Otago, we've got oat milk being made, which is stretchy oat milk, and there's a massively growing demand for that overseas. And we're one of the only places that can make it where it actually stretches really well for coffees. If we can add that value rather than just exporting our oats overseas, I think then we'll be able to benefit from the innovation that we have here as well.
Thank you. Do we have one more question for Ingrid? Oh, go on, Greg.
Do we have a supermarket monopoly or duopoly here that's ramping up food prices? And if so, is it possible to control that?
I think it's interesting that Minister Clark called for that research to be done. We've seen the research, and obviously it's up to the Minister now what happens to that. But I think it's pretty clear from that research that there isn't enough competition. Personally, I think what I would like to see is far more food cooperatives. Cooperatives are a fantastic form of social enterprise. If we can incentivise cooperatives, we get more competition, we get more community, we get greater choice, we get more locally produced food, which means it's slower food. So I'd like to see that enabled. And in order to do that though, you know, it's a little bit like being tangata tiriti, that there's a lot of people who recognise the issues, but when it comes to having to give something up, they're not quite at that point. If we're really serious about this stuff, we have to be prepared to give something up, and sometimes that means paying a bit more. I've just sourced some paint. I'm painting some walls in my house and found a New Zealand company that treats its staff really well. It's carbon neutral, and it's really good. You don't breathe these sort of toxic fumes that you might with ordinary paints. And I've managed to finally convince the painter that I really definitely want to do this, even though the margin on the paint is a little bit higher. But I'm happy to do that because, and he said, well, this other paint company's New Zealand based as well. And then he said, oh, but they don't treat their staff very well. I said, well, you just clinched it for me. I'm prepared to do that insofar that I can, and I'm privileged to be able to do that. And I totally recognise that some people, for example, have to buy caged eggs and they'd love to buy free range, but they can't. But the more we all are prepared to give something up, the more we enable those who can't to be able to actually be part of that as well, and have that dignity in doing that. So it's just about collective action, I think.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Ingrid, you can stay there. I wonder if we can have our panel back, and if one of you doesn't mind bringing your own chair, because we've got one less chair coming up. And I haven't given them warning I'm going to ask them to do this, but what I thought would be good to do, come on up, don't be shy. Do we have any more questions from the floor for anyone on the panel or for Ingrid?
Oh, I also agree with personally, this is not government policy, no GST on fruit and vegetables.
I think we all agree with that. Yeah, that's good to hear. We'll look forward to seeing that go through. So, okay, well, what I'm going to invite you to do, I'll let Ingrid go first because she definitely has the gift of the gab. And I mean that in a good way. I just wanted to give everyone from our panel and Ingrid a chance for a last word. So you've got a room full of people from the community. I know some of the people here. I know we've got academics here. I know we've got church leaders here. I know we've probably got people from social agencies and people who've come from the community. This is your opportunity to say something, influence them. Are you guys easily influenced? No, but what sort of last word would you like to leave us with? And your time is 1 minute.
Two things. One is I believe that the way that we deal with food and our mental health crisis currently are totally related. And if we can crack the food thing, we will see the sense of belonging connection that will help so many people who are feeling lonely and disconnected. Secondly, in the words of some of the young people at Festival of the Future, which was start now, everybody's got a role to play, and if not us, who, and if not when, if not now, when.
Thank you so much. Susie?
My one is that I would like to see eventually that the conversation changes from food poverty and food insecurity to what a food secure Aotearoa or New Zealand looks like, and how we get to what we want to look like rather than where we are at the moment.
Thank you, Susie. Winsome?
I would like to think that we could all enjoy food instead of worrying about food. And that includes having a perspective which means not thinking about the nutrients of everything you put in your mouth, but the people you're sharing it with and the environment that you're sharing it in.
KJ?
It's about connecting with the younger generation and sharing that love of food, sharing that knowledge of harvesting kai and growing food in your garden and sharing food with neighbours, community, people around you.
Thanks, KJ. Sure.
Well, I don't want to say this being the last person here, but I think we're probably not angry enough about this as we should be. And so I'm wondering if we can be angry in a productive way to, like, I agree 100% with everything else, everything that's been said, but can we harness some of how uncomfortable we are with the situation as it stands to actually push things forward so that change happens much quicker than it appears to be.
Thank you, Sean. Well, can we show our appreciation for I want to say a big thank you to Ben Wakefield and Val from what was the marae called? Papatūānuku Marae, and to Sean Connolly, Catherine, KJ Davey, Susie Townshend, Ingrid Leary, and Winston Parnell. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone who's come out tonight. It would have been a very strange and awkward event if there was no audience participating. Can I acknowledge Greg, runner with the microphone, and David, his technical assistant at the back, and Bruce and Tong Siu, who are making a recording, and that recording will be available on our website if you want to catch up if your notes weren't sufficiently full at the end of the evening.
Before you invite us to a cup of tea, I'd also like to thank you, Jonathan, because I've been involved with 3 of these, and I was serious when I said I'd rather be here than drinking whiskey. This is a much more nutritious conversation, and just really, it is such a great thing as an MP. It's such a luxury to be able to have an event convened like this, let alone 3 of them, a series that have been put together so well and have given us such useful things to think about and to feed in and to have access to questions and experts on each of them. So thank you very much to you and your whole team.
So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. God bless you all. Have a great night. You're very welcome to stay and chat. I won't turn the lights off until 10 o'clock. So hang around if you like, and welcome to stay for a tea and coffee. But go well, and go well.